This is the Education Business Podcast for consultants and business owners providing services in schools. I'm Claire Riley, and I'll be sharing how to start, grow and scale your education business.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Education Business Podcast. I have a guest again with me today, and it is Laura McInerney, who founded Teacher Tapp. Now, Laura was a teacher in a former life, and now she helps tens of thousands of teachers and education businesses understand better how teachers really think. So let's get to the episode. Laura, welcome to the Education Business Podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So tell us your story. We love a good story on the Education Business Podcast, especially from people who were teachers first and now they are doing something completely different. So what is your journey out of teaching to where you are now?
I taught for 6 years in East London. In the mid-2000s, I was a citizenship teacher, which at that time was cool and sexy and new. And these days, much harder to get a pure citizenship job, but I absolutely loved it. Came in through the Teach First program, didn't think I'd stay, got into it and thought I'd then stay forever. So did those 6 years. But at the end of it, I'd applied for a Fulbright scholarship to go to the US for a couple of years, mainly because I was married at that time and my partner reported on NFL and so wanted to go out to the US. There weren't many opportunities. I applied for this Fulbright scholarship really on a total whim, didn't think we'd get it. It was very chancy, but we did. So I spent a couple of years out in Missouri. And as part of that, I was going to do a dissertation at the time about free schools. So I put in a Freedom of Information request to the government and I found myself taken to court. So I was the first person taken to court under the Freedom of Information Act by a government for being vexatious. And this court case became something of a sort of cause célèbre. Is that the right word? What is the word for that? Anyway, it's a big cause across the country. I was writing Guardian columns and blogs. And because Michael Gove was the education secretary, I think people were pleased that I was sticking it in the eye to him. But it did mean that when I left Missouri to come back home, I was still in the process of those court cases. There ended up being 2 in-person ones. We were due a 3rd court case before they pulled out. And I did eventually get the documents that I was asking for, which were too late for my dissertation, but it was quite good by then because I transitioned into being a journalist, which was a job I could do while being taken to court and writing about it. And I became the editor of Schools Week. It'd only been going about 10 editions. And then I took over and was the editor of that for 3 years. So I was in journalism for a few years out of surprise, but it was good fun. It was a time when academies were setting up. There were lots of challenges. I think the government at the time weren't always following the rules, and we were able to report on that and get better behavior across the sector, which I think is now more common. And then eventually in 2017, my friend, Professor Becky Allen, was setting up a little app that was going to survey teachers. And I, as a journalist, said, look, why don't you survey all teachers? Don't just survey this small group. Try and survey as many of them as possible. Survey them on issues of the day so that I, in the newspaper, can reflect their view. Otherwise, when I write editorials, I'm just writing about the 10 or 20 teachers that I know or have spoken to that week. And she said, yeah, cool, let's do that. But you have to join me to build this thing. And so in 2017, we built the first version of Teacher Tapp, which now is an app that sits on thousands and thousands of teachers' phones. It asks 3 questions each day, and about 12,000 teachers a day answer it. And of course, it's not just Schools Week who use the statistics. It's people all across the country. I spend a lot of time on shows like More or Less on BBC, working with various different newspapers to try and get teachers' points of view and what's going on the ground out there to policymakers and the media so that it's more accurate. So that's my story. Bit of a weird one.
Wow, we love a good story, and that was a good story.
It's got some twists, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. When you said, I didn't know that part about you being taken to court. Like, I'm so shocked about that. So you were taken to court because you asked for information and the government didn't want to give it to you and they wanted to scare you off. Is that right?
Essentially, yes. I think maybe the more diplomatic answer is they felt that handing me that information would be very burdensome, was what they argued, that it would take them a long time to put it together, and that wasn't in the public interest. And I lost the first version of that court case. It went to appeal. The judge basically said, if you do it again, everybody needs to behave better. I went a 3rd round. This was over 4 years. That time they were going to take me to court again. They weren't really sure the 3rd time round why. And then at that point, I got a text message one afternoon saying, fine, you can have the documents.
there's a tenacity there, which is really impressive, and something that I think as entrepreneurs, we can all understand that contributes to success, because a lot of people would have given up there.
I think so. And I don't know if you watched the TV series The Bear. Have you seen it at all, Claire?
Oh, no.
It's really interesting. It's on Disney Plus. It's about a chef. And so there's a lot about sort of determination. And there's one episode where they're hiring people in. And a guy sits opposite a woman who's got all these qualifications and she's obviously brilliant. And when she walks out, the person next to him says, "We need to hire her." And he says, "No, because if you notice, she sat down at a table where one napkin was facing the wrong way and she didn't turn the napkin." And I've thought about this a lot since watching that episode, because I think sometimes in life, we all have things that are the equivalent of our napkins, like we're just not going to let it drop. As a teacher, I think you often have that standard around behavior or certain aspects of learning. I think in business, you have to decide where you're going to turn the napkin and just never let it drop. And for me, certainly, that was one of those situations where I decided that I wasn't going to let the government try and put me off or bully me. That information was important. I just I couldn't walk out without turning the napkin. So I think it's a good thing sometimes in business to think about, what are those things for you?
Yeah, what you really care about. But I think there's a bravery there with who it was up against as well. And I think, especially from a teacher's perspective, a lot of us leave the classroom, and you'll see it in the data that you get, and we feel quite broken because of just how hard it's been, or perhaps sometimes it's leadership. And often that happens not because the leadership want to act in the way that they are doing, but because they're also fearful of their leadership, if that makes sense. But I think to have done that and still stood up in the face of that adversity is just really impressive.
Thank you. And I have to say that I know from Teacher Tapp and surveying teachers over the last 7 years, lots of people do end up leaving teaching because they felt that way. But I didn't. I loved it. And I have to say that the schools where I worked, particularly Stratford School Academy, which I'm still a member of now, many years later after being a trustee, like all of the staff there were so unbelievably supportive of me. I worked there twice over the 6 years, and I left there feeling so positive about teaching. And it goes to show that actually in the ecosystem of schools, being somewhere where you do feel supported and those people make you feel 300 feet tall every time you walk in the door is so important. And if you're not getting it in your current school, do remember there are other schools out there where that is the case.
Yeah, yeah, and such an important point. And I see in the Facebook groups as well, often people say, I want to leave teaching, and there will always be that person who says, try a different school. I tried a different school and it worked for me. So there's definitely that, isn't there? And also knowing what kind of school will work for you.
100%. 100%.
So just to pick up then, so you went and you became the editor of Schools Week, but you were a teacher just before that. Do you think that because you were putting yourself out there with the court case, that helped you step into a journalism role?
Maybe. It is interesting. Sometimes people ask, is there a similarity between journalism and teaching? Did the skills parallel across? And I'll be honest, I didn't find a huge amount of things that paralleled that well. And I've also felt like that about business. They often feel like three quite different spheres. But what teaching gave me is sometimes when we did news stories and people will kick off, it can be quite scary when you've suddenly got 30 angry people on social media shouting at you. But that's not really the same as being in a classroom with year 9 where they're angry with you. That's much scarier and much harder to deal with. And so I think I ended up being able to roll through some of the more challenging parts of being an editor, or not take them quite as personally as others did, because of going through schools where I think you get taught how to manage your emotions really well.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Although I would say, because I've not been a journalist, but in terms of business and social media, that is the thing you worry about, reputational damage. That's where it's not in the confines of a classroom with 30 children, like it could be viral. And so there's always that worry. I think that is interesting because I work with a lot of teachers who have stepped out of teaching now in business. And I would say that's a big fear really of theirs, especially when it comes to putting themselves out there on social media, is what if I say something that then is going to get that backlash? But I guess when you're writing, sometimes you're writing knowing that you will get that backlash. You're expecting that.
Yeah, you can't please all of the people all the time. So in order to be fair, truthful to what you think or the fact. You have to be aware of the situation, which will mean that sometimes people won't like it. I will say there was one time, I don't even remember the specifics of it, although I was bereft at the time, where I went on to, I think it was Newsnight, and must have said something which I either regretted afterwards or hadn't put very well or whatever it was. And I remember being really upset. And thankfully, one of the leaders over at Schools Week came to me and he said, look, all people are going to remember is that you were on the telly. In a couple of weeks' time, they're not going to remember the specifics of this. Take the win that you got to be on national television, and sure, it wasn't perfect, but how awesome is that? That's something that other people will spend a whole lifetime never getting to do. And the fact that you're upset right now, just let that fade away and remember the main thing. And that's important if you are worried about it. It doesn't mean go out, be thoughtless. But on occasion, if something goes viral, the chances that people are going to remember that and hold it against you forever is really small.
That is such great advice. So Teacher Tapp, you've given us a little insight into what Teacher Tapp does, but I think you can help education businesses in a really special way. How can you help education businesses?
So Teacher Tapp came about because someone like me at Schools Week at that time had a need to better understand teachers. I wanted to do it because I was writing editorials based on the assumptions of what teachers thought. But of course, I wanted to know what they really thought. I wasn't alone in that. There are many different organizations that can benefit from knowing what teachers are doing, thinking, feeling, needing, wanting. And that's what our surveys do each and every day. Now, you can be on the app even if you're not a teacher. So when you sign up on Teacher Tapp, you just click that you're not a teacher. And although each day your experience of Teacher Tapp will look the same, you're not actually included in our results. We also have a newsletter, which you can sign up to, which can send out weekly stats that tell you about what's on Teacher Tapp. And we have weekly blogs on teachertapp.co.uk, and it's tap with 2 Ps. Back in 2017, it was like the app that you tap. These days, it's just a function of the fact we have that extra P. But teachertapp.co.uk, you'll find our blog. And every week, we're publishing new insights into what's happening on the ground. And that can be really important for whatever you're doing, whether you're someone who provides curriculum, whether you look at supply, whether you do something really super niche in a particular area of SEND. There's usually something in there that you can think, that's either a growing problem, a growing trend, or something else that's going on in schools that can be helpful.
Yeah. Have you thought about surveying tutors?
We've thought about surveying loads of different groups over time. Childcare comes up sometimes, FE comes up, university students. The thing about, so we're mainly in England and in primary and secondary mainstream schools. We do have some teachers from other sectors and we love having them on, or from Scotland or wherever, but the questions aren't always quite as relevant. The reason why we've ended up with that particular group is they're very large. So there's about 500,000 teachers in England alone, predominantly in primary and secondary schools. Once you've got a very small group, what's harder is to get a critical mass of people signed up. And also, the more diverse they are, the harder it is to ask a set of questions that's similar. So the reason why we can't easily ask questions that suit Wales and Scotland is that their curriculum is different, their exam system is different, and therefore a bunch of questions are different. If you think about tutors, it's a massively diverse group. Some people will be doing it full time every day, 5 days a week. Other people might only do it for a couple of weeks per year. And so because of that, it's hard to work out which questions you could ask on a daily basis that would be relevant for a large enough group.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. And obviously there's fewer of them as well, isn't there, in Wales and Scotland than there is in England?
Yes, and that doesn't mean that someday we won't be able to find a way or get our act together to put some questions out that could work for maybe a whole year for Wales and Scotland. We would love to work with some partners on doing that. We would just need to look at the model, because the model in England is that there are enough people who want to commission the research, which is the paid services that we have, that enables us to fund the panel, fund the people to write the specialist questions, do the data cleaning and the data analysis. Whereas in Scotland and Wales, not only are there fewer schools, but also that ecosystem of research, maybe because there's fewer people, just isn't really there in the same way.
So what's an example of commissioning some research from Teacher Tapp?
2 big research reports that we do every year, or have done for the last 5 or 6 years, is with Gatsby Foundation. We do an annual recruitment and retention report that's available on our website, comes out usually in June each year. And they survey on a set of questions each year about how people feel about being in the teaching profession. For example, do you still see yourself teaching in 3 years' time? We have really seen those numbers drop off since 2019 in quite scary ways. So that has been at the forefront of tracking teacher sentiment and why we might be seeing some of the shortages that we've seen over the last few years. We also work with Pearson on an annual school report, looking at a range of different topics over time, also freely available online. Lots and lots of information in last year's one about technology in schools that was particularly important for those of you who are listening who work with schools on tech. Lots of people assume that every school has got, for example, Wi-Fi, and yet only about half of teachers say that Wi-Fi is reliable across their school. So if you're creating a product, a device, software that relies on reliable Wi-Fi, you will be limiting the number of people who can use it, for example. So they're two big ones, but we do lots and lots of other little tiny commissions as well.
Yeah, it's so true about the Wi-Fi. I think sometimes we can have big ideas about products that would be great, but it really would only service maybe a Matt who had a ton of money, or everyone's got a device, and it is hard, isn't it? Because we want to make sure that we're, from a content perspective, thinking into the future, but we can't think too far ahead in terms of where schools actually are right now.
Absolutely. And also the pandemic didn't change it anywhere near as much as people expected. Even I expected, right? So before the pandemic, I think it was something like 58% of teachers were given a laptop by their school. And I expected that number to shoot up in the pandemic. And afterwards, it's been around the 63 to 65% range, just not changed as much as you would think.
Yeah. Do people tell you where they go when they leave teaching?
We ask some questions at the end of the year around whether they're going into other jobs, but NFER actually do quite a lot on that already. So we know the types of jobs that people go into are often education allied, and also that people do take pay cuts. One of our most interesting open questions, so the 3 questions each day are generally multiple choice, but we did ask an open question once about what would you most like to do? And I was fascinated about how many people said they'd like to open a bookshop. So I think that's the number one destination for people leaving teaching if they could make it work. I'm not sure that it's that easy to make enough money if you do that, though.
No, I don't know if you've heard of Reading Rocks. So when she was in teaching, she had a conference where she would work with publishers on new books, and she would bring them to the conference, and then she'd have a number of different speakers on reading. When she left teaching, it became a subscription, but she actually opened a bookshop by the sea. So I think she lives in St Ives in Cornwall now.
Fantastic.
So she did make that work, but as a dual business.
That is the ultimate teacher dream. I feel like by the sea is often also what people write. So if she ever wants staff, I'm pretty certain that she could have a whole line of people down the streets to work there.
I will totally get her to listen to this episode. Cool. Oh, that's been so helpful. Thank you so much. So imagine that you are listening to this podcast episode and you're an education business. Maybe you create resources. Maybe you're a tutor. Maybe you have lessons for homeschool children. What are the actions that you can take to start using insights in your business more? Because I feel like this is the door that we could open when we start out in business. We do it based on what we believe, because maybe we were the ideal customer at some point, or we are the ideal customer. And then as time goes on, particularly for me, I haven't been in the classroom as a teacher since 2015. So that's 9 years ago. We have to find another way to get the insights and to understand where teachers are at now. What would you say the next steps that we could do are in order to be finding out the information that should be fueling us in our business?
Any business should be talking to their customers a lot and finding out what they like, what they don't like, and going in that direction. I think what Teacher Tapp is very good at doing is, because it talks to a very large group of people, so as I say, about 12,000 across the country each day, we reweight that data and we also are able to split it down in our weekly. It's very accurate, and it means it's giving you the picture of the people that you might not be speaking to. And even after 7 years, you'd think by now I would know the answer to most of these questions. And yet any given week, I will bet what teachers are going to say, and it will be wrong, because I have a bias towards thinking about secondary schools in inner cities, a particular age group that I hang out with. And so I'll sometimes just entirely forget primary schools for the millionth time, or I'll entirely forget about the Northeast or whatever it is. And I think keeping up on trends nationally, whether through the press, whether through Teacher Tapp, is just helpful for giving you a little bit more perspective sometimes on what opportunities are available. And things do change quite quickly. Even in the time we've been doing this, I would say that we've gone from, in 2017, workload being about data often. So lots of issues around data drops and around expectations on planning, to a shift over to lots of workload around curriculum. To the last 2 years, the biggest issues coming up from teachers are around behavior and managing more and more complex special educational needs, and therefore really wanting resources, really wanting things that will help support in those areas. It doesn't mean everyone's forgotten about workload and data, or everybody's forgotten about curriculum. But what it does tell you is there is a bit of a shift that is often outside of your powers as a business. So if actually you're really into helping people with data, that's still going to be the thing that you drive on, but you might want to couch what they could do with that time slightly differently because there are some other issues. Or you might want to think about, is there a way that data can help with managing behavior, for example? So it's worth keeping those trends in mind, because that's where the minds of the people that you're working with are also going.
Yeah. And I think you touched on some really important points. My teaching background is that I trained as a secondary school teacher in performing arts. I never really learned to have children behind a desk. Then ended up going into primary schools, teaching year fours, and I had to relearn everything I needed to know in maths, English, all that kind of thing. Everyone's behind a desk. And I did a lot of supply teaching as well. I went into lots of different schools of all different backgrounds in secondary and in primary. And that was something I've really tried to help the team with, because I forget the fact that I had that knowledge from across the board was really helpful, because I'd have people say to me, I think we should do this because we did this in my school. And they've been in that school 10 years, which is not a bad thing. But you don't realize, I don't think sometimes, until you're looking at something like your data, that every school is quite different in lots of different ways. And it's trying to find something that's going to work for the majority of those teachers or those schools, isn't it?
Absolutely. The diversity in the teaching profession is amazing, actually, because it's not the same job, as you've just pointed out there. It's not the same job to be a year 4 teacher as it is to be an art teacher in a 6th form. They're really wildly different. And so you get lots of different opinions, lots of people who want to do things differently. And the good news about that is there's almost something for everybody in the teaching profession. And nothing works everywhere. Most things will work somewhere. There's usually an opportunity. It's just about finding your niches and the right people to work with, and remembering that things move quickly. Year on year, the trends change.
Yeah. Laura, thank you so much for your time. This has been so insightful. And I know that there'll be people who have never heard of Teacher Tapp before who are going to go download it. I'm glad you've said that about you can do it not as a teacher, because I've looked multiple times and I didn't realize that. I thought, oh no, I'll skew the data up. But if I'm not going to skew the data up, I'm going to download it, because just before the call, I said, someone in my team is like your biggest fan. And I know he's on it every single day. And I did wonder how, but now I know.
Yeah, we welcome all data. Previously, the chief inspector, we know, was on there keeping an eye. So clicked not a teacher, but it was a way of keeping in touch with what was going on in the ground. Because when you are the chief inspector, people will say one thing to you and then another thing when you're out of the room. So it's a really good way of keeping an eye out without all of the politeness that British people often have when having live conversations with each other. So yeah, you're very welcome on board, as are any of your listeners.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Claire.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm definitely going to be downloading Teacher Tapp and signing up as a non-teacher, because I want to know the questions that are being asked and to be able to see the data as well. So I suggest you do the same. And here's to getting more insights that will help you in your education business journey.
Thank you for listening to the Education Business Podcast. To get more information to grow your business, sign up at educationbusinessclub.co.uk.